Hello, everyone. I'm Tabitha. I am the Foundling Museum today, and I would very much like to welcome you to today's online talk, which is Charles Jennens, the man behind Handel's Messiah, with Ruth Smith. This talk is part of our public program, and it accompanies our current display, Charles Jennens, Patron and Polymath, which is in the Gerald Cook Handel collection at the Foundling Museum. As today's speaker will explore, Charles Jennens is best known as the librettist of Handel's Messiah, but he had a range of intellectual interests. The display brings together portraits, correspondence, and printed documents, which reflect the varied interests and achievements of this polymath of George and Britain, and it's really well worth a visit. Before I introduce today's speakers, I have a couple of reminders. This talk is being recorded, and the recording will be shared on our YouTube channel in the next couple of weeks when we upload it. So we will put that online. And if you've missed any of our other talks, if you type in the Foundling Museum into YouTube and then find our channel, you can catch up on them. So at the end of the talk, we will be doing a Q&A session. So we actively encourage you to ask questions at the end. You are all muted at present. So the system we're going to do for this is that if you have any questions as you go along, please put them in the chat. And then at the end of the session, I will read out some questions and Ruth can answer them. If we have too many questions, I will have to call time, but I will give you an email address that you can email them to, and then Ruth can answer them for you later. So, Ruth Smith, our speaker today, has published widely on Handel's vocal works and intellectual history of the 18th century. Her monograph, Handel's Oratorios and 18th Century Thought, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2005 and was awarded a British Academy Prize. Her short illustrated book, Charles Jennens, the man behind Handel's Messiah, was published in 2012, and it was to accompany the exhibition she curated at the Handel House Museum, which actually led the Times Literary Supplement to acclaim Jennens as Handel's most significant collaborator. And Ruth has also given talks worldwide on Handel's works and legacy. And so quite the knowledgeable woman. And the book on Charles Jennens is available to buy in the Foundling Museum shop. So you can buy that in person at the shop, or else you can give us an email and we can arrange postage and payment for you then. So I'm going to stop waffling now because it's a bit boring. So I'm going to mute myself and turn invisible, but I will be here, and I'm going to give it over to Ruth now. So take it away, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Tabitha. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning in to this talk. Jennens, who has interested me for many years, was a very multifaceted man, and one can't do justice to all his achievements in an hour, but I hope to suggest to you who he was and what is interesting about him. And as the exhibition, which is on at the moment in the Foundling Museum, is actually on the site of the former Foundling Hospital, let me start there. Here it is in 1749, now in the heart of London's Bloomsbury, but in Handel's and Jennens's time, the Foundling Hospital was in open fields, in healthy fresh air outside the city, as was shown by Rock in his famous map of 1746. You can see the buildings at the top of the map. Likewise, the nearby streets were desirable residential locations because of the good air, and this was where Jennens lived when he came up to London for the winter season, initially in Queen's Square, southwest of the Foundling Hospital, and then on the north side of Great Ormond Street, which you see running east of Queen's Square, actually backing onto Foundling Hospital land. He had a house built for him. As you see, the house of a man of substantial means, especially considering that his principal residence was in the country and he was a bachelor. Jennens was rich. The exhibition calls him a philanthropist, and indeed he was, in many areas of social and cultural life. So it's a bit odd that he seems not to have donated to the Foundling Hospital, his near neighbour. But in one signal way, he was a major benefactor to it. Messiah, which we've already heard, is now his greatest claim to fame, earned the Foundling Hospital over £1 million in modern money in his lifetime from Handel's fundraising performances of it. And Messiah and yet more, much more subsequently. Handel having bequeathed a score and vocal and instrumental parts of Messiah to the charity so that they could continue to put on fundraising performances of it. In his will, Handel called Messiah my oratorio. But in writing to Jennens from Dublin before giving its first performance, he called it your oratorio. It was with the greatest pleasure I saw the continuation of your kindness by the lines you was pleased to send me in order to be prefixed to your oratorio, Messiah, which I set to music before I left England. We now know that Messiah was Jennens's brainchild. Jennens celebrated their joint authorship in the portrait of Handel that he commissioned from Thomas Hudson and is now in the National Portrait Gallery, where Handel has the score of Messiah open in front of him. And Jennens gave it this wonderful celebratory frame. And it's for Messiah and his other collaborations with Handel that Jennens now matters most to us. He is principally important as the provider of librettos for 5 of Handel's most imaginative and lasting English masterpieces, in addition to Messiah, Saul, L'Allegro, Belshazzar, and probably part of Israel in Egypt. He was Handel's most significant collaborator, inasmuch as more than anyone, he stimulated Handel to develop English oratorio and to push out the boundaries of dramatic music and to extend the expressiveness of music. And to return to the exhibition's title, he was a generous philanthropist. Among other causes he supported, he helped to bring into being and funded 6 London hospitals and the new charity for musicians, what's now the Royal Society of Musicians. His legacy charities recorded on his tomb by his nephew and executors amounted in modern terms to, again, over £1 million. His beneficiaries included local schools, a girls' orphanage, and a home for former prostitutes. Having no children of his own, says the inscription, he endeavored to become as general a parent and benefactor to mankind as possible. According to his death notice in a leading London paper, he was a man of exemplary piety and erudition, a patron of the polite arts, and possessed of that nobleness of soul which true charity and benevolence can only characterize. So why, for more than 2 centuries, was the received view of Jennens one of sneering contempt, such as we find in a book published as recently as 2008 and endorsed by no less a historian than David Cannadine? Have a look at some portraits of Jennens while I read it to you. Charles Jennens dissipated his fortune in pursuit of culture, earning himself the nickname Solomon the Magnificent. Charles was a vain popinjay who lived in princely style in his Brobdingnagian mansion, Gopsall Hall in Leicestershire, surrounded by dozens of servants dressed in ornate equipage. In London, he covered the short distance from his house in Great Ormond Street to his publishers in Red Lion Court in a carriage drawn by 4 grandly caparisoned horses, preceded by 4 lackeys who swept the oyster shells off the pavements before he descended to the street. Jennens was a man of conflicts, and his reputation is one of them. I'm mentioning it because you may be familiar with this dismissive view of him that occluded his character and achievements for more than 2 centuries. And you may wonder what it's based on. The answer is envy. The derogatory view of Jennens, including the details I've just quoted, descend from a single source, the Shakespeare editor, George Steevens. Inoffensive and ingratiating though he looks, Steevens was a dishonest, power-seeking critic who wanted to dominate the growing Shakespeare market. Jennens, having accumulated an unrivaled collection of early printings of Shakespeare texts, threatened to be a serious editorial rival to Steevens when he brought out an edition of King Lear in 1770, around the time when the portraits I've just been showing you were painted. Steevens had an amusingly malicious tongue and powerful friends, and easily got his views into print and admired. Even such absurd views as that Jennens's edition was too exact. Modern scholarship disagrees. Jennens's Shakespeare texts, he published 5 plays in all, are now recognized as being more scholarly than any previous editions. Here's his Hamlet. He set modern standards for the first time in 2 ways you can see here. One was that he published each play in a single volume, till then unprecedented, and equally unprecedented, he printed notes, emendations, comments, explications on the page, whereas previously they had been published in separate volumes at the end of complete editions. What Jennens was doing here was establishing for the first time, inventing variorum editions of Shakespeare. Here for comparison is the modern Arden edition, very similar. Interestingly for us too, Jennens's annotations show an appreciation of the plays as staged drama, not just as dry text on a library shelf. Appreciation of the way the text is spoken in performance, a lively apprehension of the emotional logic of character, and vivid imagining of characters' interactions. The very same abilities that made him a good librettist for Handel's music dramas. When Jennens defended his edition, always an unwise thing to do, Stephens was unable to respond on scholarly grounds, so he resorted to personal abuse, of which this is a small sample. The chief error of Mr. Jennens's life consisted in his perpetual association with a set of men every way inferior to himself. By these means, he lost all opportunities of improvement, but gained what he preferred, flattery in excess. He generally took care to patronize such tradesmen and such artists as few other persons would employ. In saying this, Stephens either really didn't know or chose to ignore that actually Jennens was the chosen collaborator of the greatest Virgil scholar of his generation, that he commissioned the most original work of the greatest sculptor in England, that he produced librettos for Britain's leading composer, that he commissioned and himself largely planned what recent architectural historians call the finest example in the English provinces of late Pelagian architecture, his Leicestershire home at Gopsall, that his art collection was published in a survey of the best art collections in England, and that he was one of the guests at a Royal Academy dinner alongside David Garrick, Edmund Burke, and Horace Walpole. This is Jennens earlier in life, in his early 40s, painted by Thomas Hudson. In the address at Jennens's funeral, his local vicar in Leicestershire, the Reverend George Kelly, said this about him: "He was a person of no small share of erudition, being an able linguist and well-versed in classical learning, which he constantly endeavored to improve by enriching his library with a judicious and expensive collection of some of the most approved authors, both ancient and modern, which were not placed there out of ostentation, but were diligently and carefully consulted by him as occasion offered." And his erudition is confirmed in his correspondence that's on show in the Foundling Museum exhibition. And in case you suspect that in saying this, the Reverend Kelly must have been one of the undeserving flatterers that Stephens invented, because after all, Jennens was also very generous to his local church and to religious education. Here's another part of Kelly's funeral address about Jennens, which I think the portrait we're looking at illustrates rather well. There might appear in him a degree of shyness and a reserved disposition, especially in mixed companies, which some might construe into a moroseness and singularity of temper, a delicate texture of the nervous system, too liable to irritation, from whence arise violent perturbations and anxieties of the mind, and not infrequently an extreme lowness and depression of spirits. It is well known that he heartily bewailed this his infirmity and was frequently angry with himself on this account. Don't you think that's rather an extraordinary passage to put in a funeral address, more like psychological analysis than a eulogy? And perhaps the Reverend Kelly is aiming to match the honesty and forthrightness of his subject. Shy, reserved. To me, the portraits of Jennens by Hudson, especially this one, show that rather than vanity. Perhaps almost as if he's challenging the viewer to pluck out the heart of his mystery. Much of his achievement was by no means ostentatious, contra Stevens, but private. According to Kelly, in his Philanthropy, quote, he was never heard to boast of the favors he had bestowed, observing that most excellent precept of our Lord, not to let his left hand know what his right hand did. For instance, he published all his Shakespeare editions anonymously. Likewise, his librettos for Handel were unsigned, unattributed, which is one reason that his authorship of the Messiah libretto was often disbelieved until quite recently. And one could add that whereas librettists were normally paid by the composer for their work, Jennens' librettos for Handel were presents for him. This is perhaps more familiar to those of you who have visited the Handel house before it was shut for its wonderful renovations currently ongoing. Another portrait by Hudson. Jennens, as Kelly says, was depressive, and he admitted as much to close friends. He overcame periods of incapacitating misery to be productive. So all the more should we admire the scope of his intellectual energy. There's hardly any branch of culture in which he didn't proactively engage as patron or as contributor, and always researching, thinking, rethinking, reworking, synthesizing, critiquing, and self-critiquing to high standards of creativity and scholarship and taste in music, theatre, literature, painting, architecture, garden design, doing much more, as I said, than we can cover here. So in the rest of this talk, I'll attempt to illustrate the man with some instances of the activities that flowed from what I think we can discern were the four commitments that guided his life. His commitment to his religious beliefs, to his political principles, to his friendships, and to music, especially the music of Handel. And in closing, I'll take a biographer's look at the nature of the collaboration for which he's most famous, his collaboration with Handel, leaving, I hope, some time for discussion. First, a brief reference to his origins and early years, which explain much of his later life. This is the Jacobean country house of Gopsall in Leicestershire, in which in 1700 Jennens was born. His family on his father's side were leading Birmingham ironmasters. By the end of the 17th century, they were producing over 2,000 tons of cast iron every year with timber from properties in 6 counties. And his grandfather had bought this estate of Gopsall, 736 acres, 15 years before Jennens was born. Jennens's mother died when he was only 7. His elder half-brother, his 2 younger brothers, and 2 of his 3 sisters died before he was 30. One of his younger brothers dying by his own hand in a particularly shocking manner. Jennens's beloved niece, who was to have inherited his properties, also predeceased him. Jennens was lonely at home, and his principal solace in life was music. And there's evidence of his musical enthusiasm, at least from his teenage years. He went up to Oxford when he was 15. This is the notice of his admission in his college benefactors book. And there he joined the Oxford University Music Club. Subsequently, he amassed a stellar and immensely important music collection representing the work of over 40 composers, mainly English and Italian. In particular, a self-confessed addict of Handel's music, he aimed to acquire a copy of every note that Handel ever wrote, both in print, and here he is subscribing for 6 copies of Alexander's Feast, far more than any other subscriber, and also in specially copied music manuscripts, in which a competent keyboard player he often added to the figuration of the bass parts. He left to his young cousin, the Earl of Aylesford, the most comprehensive collection ever made of Handel's music. Through all the many iterations of Jennens's plans for rebuilding Gopsall House, he added the 4 rooms at the sides here. A music room, which is on the top right, and this plan, by the way, which is in the Royal Institute of British Architects, is annotated in Jennens's own hand. A music room was a staple addition through all the very varied plans made for enlargement and improvement of the original house. In this music room, once it was built, he installed a pipe organ built to Handel's specification. He acquired one of the first pianos in England, shipped for him from its maker in Florence, a piano on which Handel enjoyed playing. He had a folding music desk made with stands for 14 players so that he could join friends in domestic music making. Also on the plan, bottom right, you'll see a library. Jennens's library of over 10,000 volumes was really remarkable outside the circles of aristocracy and old money. At Oxford, his college was Balliol. This is a 19th century picture, but the building up against the tree was there in Jennens's time, and his room was on the end, facing the tree. At Balliol, in addition to the standard Oxford curriculum of classical literature, divinity, ethics, and logic, one could also study poetry, rhetoric, mathematics, pure and applied, Hebrew, geography, astronomy, modern history, biography, and the sciences. Jennens acquired a thorough grasp of Greek and Latin, and probably a grounding in Hebrew to judge from the contents of his library and his correspondence. And he was still corresponding with his Oxford tutor about points of classical scholarship 25 years later. Jennens didn't need to work for his living. Had he wanted a professional career, he would have had to sacrifice his political principles. These he probably acquired from his mother's family, the Burdettes of Foremark Hall, this is their house, near to the place where Bonnie Prince Charlie turned back from his invasion of England in 1746, having, it's said, first sought help from the well-connected Burdettes, who were loyal to the deposed Stuart regime. A brief reminder here of British politics in Jennens's time. In 1714, by Act of Parliament, the Hanoverian monarchs replaced the Stuart dynasty. Thenceforth, anyone who wanted to hold any public professional office, whether legal, academic, political, military, in the church, or even as a local magistrate, had to take prescribed oaths in which they forswore, abjured the Stuart claim to the throne. Unlike many, Jennens wouldn't do that. For him, the Stuarts, now effectively classed as pretenders to the throne, were the rightful anointed kings. So Jennens was what's known as a non-juror, and as such, effectively condemned himself to a life of internal exile. He did have a slender, like-minded context amongst those of similar principles, and he used some of his wealth to be a generous patron, in fact, the leading patron of his generation, to less well-off non-jurors. For example, his great friend, the Virgil scholar Edward Holdsworth. Their correspondence is a star of the Cook collection and the exhibition. Here, Holdsworth is seen on the right in his role as bear leader, guide to young men doing the grand tour on the continent, because Holdsworth had stuck to his principles, which he shared with Jennens, and surrendered his Oxford fellowship rather than forswear the Stuarts. This painting is by James Gopsall, and he put himself in the painting over there on the left, and he's declaring his own principles because he's dressed in tartan. This must have been a picture that was only circulated amongst like-minded friends. Jennens had himself depicted by another non-juror, Giles Hussey, who was famous in Jacobite circles for having made a portrait of Bonnie Prince Charlie. Unlike these non-jurors I've just mentioned, Jennens was a Jacobite in principle, not in practice, and of a very specific kind. This is his seal, a portrait head in profile of King Charles I. And this slide shows it alongside its source. The frontispiece of the book called Icon Basilicae, The Image of the King, King Charles I's Apologia, supposedly written by him while awaiting execution, famous in its time and still being frequently reprinted in the 19th century. Jennens was, like Charles I, a high Anglican, whereas the subsequent Stuart rulers, Charles II, James II, and James's descendants, were Roman Catholic. So Jennens, the devout Anglican, couldn't give them his unqualified loyalty, which explains some of Jennens's depressiveness. He had no real home in any society. He was doubly conflicted. The Stuarts were the rightful rulers, but the Hanoverians were on the throne. The Hanoverians who were on the throne had the right religious faith, Protestantism, which was why Parliament had put them there, but they weren't legitimate rulers. They could be shown to be only 58th in line to the throne. The Stuarts were the rightful rulers, but they couldn't be restored because they had the wrong religion, Roman Catholicism, which was very important at this time when European states were politically defined and aligned by their religious affiliation. Jennens inscribed this dilemma into his libretto of Saul for Handel, of which more later perhaps. I said that music was Jennens's chief solace. He would probably have said it was his chief solace after his Christian faith, which, as we've already seen, was very important to him. In fact, he made it part of every major aspect of his life. Let me show you some pieces of visual evidence. This is a view of Gopsall after Jennens had finished his rebuilding of it. And on the left, you can just make out the monument that he erected to the memory of his now late friend Holdsworth. And I hope you can see that it's surmounted by a statue. This statue, which we've already seen once, Religion or Christian Faith, was commissioned by Jennens from Roubiliac, who was then Britain's leading sculptor. And Jennens specified the inscriptions on the statue, which is now in the basement of a museum in Leicester. The cross bears the phrase which by tradition prompted the conversion of Constantine, conventionally translated as, "By this sign you shall conquer." The scroll reads, "The eternal gospel," and the base reads, "The victory which conquered the world is our faith," familiar from Messiah. I think there's something very poignant about this, quite apart from its being to the memory of Jennens's closest friend. In its extraordinary position, it promulgates Christianity to the whole surrounding countryside. Yet there were very few people in the surrounding countryside, and no one would have been able to see the inscriptions. It's an intensely private statement of the desire, which we also hear in Jennens's libretto of Messiah, to spread the word of God unto the ends of the world. Looking again at the plan for the new Gopsall, note the chapel bottom left, a chapel which Jennens commissioned to be sumptuously panelled with cedar. The communion table, incidentally, was said to include timber from the oak tree in which the future Stuart King Charles II evaded capture during his flight after the Battle of Worcester. Jennens even inscribed the chimney places of Gopsall Mansion with his faith. This is the music room chimney piece showing Daniel in the lion's den being saved from the lions by an angel, an ancient Christian symbol of redemption. You see that far from attacking him, the lions are backing away, except for the one that is licking Daniel's feet. This is a design sketch for the drawing room chimney piece. It's annotated to be in green marble. Cherubim surrounding a central dramatic panel. This is a photo of it taken shortly before the demolition of Gopsall Manor in 1951. Here's a close-up so that you can see better that this is the raising of Lazarus. Christ on the right, Lazarus beginning to rise up in the center with his arms raised. This was taken from an Italian master's depiction of the scene, an etching by Castiglione. It was extraordinary at that date in England, and so far as I know, unique, to put religious motifs on one's chimney pieces. Similarly, Jennens's picture collection contained an unusually high number of religious subjects, testifying both to his individualism and to his high Anglicanism. Here, for example, is the infant Christ asleep on the cross by the Spanish painter Murillo, 17th century, now in Sheffield. In uniting the nativity with a foretelling of the crucifixion, and perhaps Jesus's arm resting on a human skull, with a foretelling of the resurrection and redemption, it's a visual analogue of Jennens's libretto of Messiah. Which brings us to Messiah. I'd like to say a little bit about Jennens's role in this. It's unsurprising that a man so thoroughly and deeply engaged with the belief in redemption through Christ should compile the libretto of Messiah, a work which Jennens clearly felt was needed by the British society of his time. It was a society in which most people still believed the Christian teaching that after death there was divine judgment and eternal life in heaven or in hell. But it was a society whose reassurance of salvation was being torpedoed from two directions. First, there was the scientific revolution. How could the clockmaker God, defined by Newton, the remote creator of the cosmos, really care about the life and fate of you, an individual? And then there was materialist and scholarly skepticism, calling into question the integrity and validity of the Bible, which included calling into question the divinity of Jesus and his power to redeem each and every one of us. To English Protestants, the English Bible was and is the bedrock of belief. So we can see why Jennens had in his collection this lovely copy by Battoni of Correggio's Madonna and Child with St. Mary Magdalene and St. Jerome, in which St. Jerome on the left is showing Jesus his translation of the Bible into the vernacular of his day. Messiah uses texts of the English vernacular Bible. Rising above the then current defensiveness of the established church against Enlightenment skepticism, and above the flood of rationalist argument that poured from the presses. While the framework of Messiah is the Apostles' Creed, the essentials of Christian doctrine, its text asserts that this doctrine, the Christian scheme of redemption, is a transcendent mystery that needs no rational justification. With his libretto of Messiah, I think Jennens was fusing three ambitions that were precious to him: to foster Handel's career, to steer Handel to set good words on worthwhile subjects, and to defend and promulgate the Protestant faith. Jennens had the genius to see that the people most alienated from Christianity, the skeptics most in danger of eternal damnation, were the people least likely to be reached by sermons and tracts, but could very likely be swayed by the universally acknowledged emotional power of Handel's music. Messiah is unique, but Jennens would have known that it wouldn't have been peculiar in Handel's output as a whole, because Jennens knew that Handel had written a work about Christ the Redeemer for Catholics in Italy, La Resurrezione, and for Lutherans in Germany, the Brockes Passion. Indeed, he had a manuscript copy of the Brockes Passion made for him without the German words in it, so that he could himself add English words, which he began to do. This is the first recitative, the evangelist describing breaking of bread at the Last Supper. But Jennens didn't go very far with this. To him, it was probably self-evident that Handel, as the world's most affecting, sublime, persuasive composer, should now remind English Protestants of the promise of salvation, with a work composed specially for them to texts drawn from their own Bible, which is what he provided. And that brings me lastly to some observations about Jennens's collaboration with Handel. It's quite surprising, actually, that they worked together so successfully when one considers their differences. Their origins. Jennens was native and provincial, born and bred in Leicestershire mud, he said. Handel was foreign and cosmopolitan. By the time they first met, he'd been a glittering success in public and private spheres in Germany, Italy, and England. Their background. Jennens's in industry, Handel's in the professions. His father was a surgeon, his mother's family were theologians. Their social position? Jennens was landed gentry, Handel was renting in Mayfair, and as a musician, he was considered a servant of the quality, the elite cultured public, which cancelled out their age difference. Handel was 15 years older than Jennens. Jennens had no profession and needed none. Handel chose to be defined by his profession to the extent of sometimes alienating his patrons by his apparent ambition to dominate the cultural scene. Jennens, as we've seen, was a private person. Handel was famous and self-publicizing. He cultivated his public identity. Even beyond his death, he prescribed his Westminster Abbey funeral and monument there. Wealth. Jennens's was large and secure. He was the eldest son, land in 6 counties. Handel's was volatile, especially during their collaboration. In 1732, he had £4,000 in the bank, and in 1739, his cashing account was empty. Temperament. Jennens was depressive and hypochondriac. Handel was resilient, bouncing back from far worse crises of health than Jennens ever had. Politics. Jennens, as we've seen, was a non-juror with Jacobite principles. Handel was a Hanoverian employee, even writing coronation anthems for the Hanoverian king. And finally, their working habits, very significant for their collaboration. Jennens was a tortoise to Handel's hare. Handel was exasperated by Jennens's slowness. Jennens was exasperated by Handel rushing him. So one might well ask, what made it work? What cemented their relationship? My answer is mutual respect, I think, founded on shared interests and shared values and shared standards. As we've already seen, they were both philanthropists. Then they had a shared interest, a shared creative interest in music and drama, and more widely, a shared attitude to the importance of public art and what public art can achieve, which prompted good librettos from Jennens, which in turn elicited from Handel great music dramas that could communicate. Though they were politically apart, they were at one in both being committed Protestants. The backbone and essence of Protestant Christianity is the Bible, and both would have respected each other's great, deep biblical knowledge. Moreover, Protestantism gave them shared valuation of the truth of God's word. And both being trained in rhetoric, they were aware of the potential power of words, and hence the obligation with any text to get it right, whether choosing the text or setting it to music. Though, of course, that could be a problem, because both of them, in their judgment on anything that they considered important, obstinately maintained their own opinion of what was right, showing a similarity of temperament that was sometimes far from helpful. They were both prickly, irascible, forthright, and strong-willed. So no wonder the collaboration was sometimes strained to breaking point. But those very disagreements often stimulated them to produce good work. Here's a page from Handel's autograph working score for Saul, a work which shows them both to be self-critical and pushing each other to new improvements. For instance, in some places, when Jennens saw how Handel had set some of his words, he altered them to fit, and then Handel altered his music to fit even better. And we shouldn't omit to say that Handel actually loaned Jennens his scores. I mean, that's extraordinary. This was the single working score, and Handel lent it to Jennens. Supposing a candle had fallen over, no more Saul. great trust between the two of them. Handel respected Jennens's views and listened to them and took them into account. For example, he restored the Hallelujah in Saul to the position that Jennens had initially given it. At the beginning, Handel moved it to the end. Jennens pointed out that it had no bearing on the end at all and was irrelevant, and it dramatically didn't work. Handel moved it back. Handel used Jennens's suggestions of the canon's anthems to recycle in Belshazzar. For l'Allegro, Handel suggested Milton's poem Blessed Pair of Sirens for part 3, and then accepted Jennens' opinion that it really wouldn't do. And in Messiah, Handel did make some changes at Jennens' instigation. Jennens was famously cross at first about Handel's setting of Messiah, but not because it was his libretto, rather because he felt Handel had failed to do justice to himself and to the subject. Jennens said, the subject excels every other subject. And Handel had told him that he would take a year about it and make it the best of his compositions, whereas in fact, he wrote Messiah in less than 4 weeks. And Jennens knew very well that Handel's usual time for writing an oratorio was actually 6 weeks. After seeing a score but not hearing it, he said, I shall put no more sacred words into his hands to be thus abused. Sacred words being abused, what he minded was Handel not showing enough respect to the words of God. And this was bad enough to cause a rift. But then Handel came back to Jennens for another libretto. Jennens's piecemeal delivery of it was especially problematic. But we can see from Handel's letter to him asking for the second act of Belshazzar how much he valued Jennens's work. And this is where I'll close. I think this is so telling. It always amuses me. If you look at the end on the right, the final 2 longest lines, you'll see that the words are squashed together. And I think this is where he's gone back later to ingratiate himself more with Jennens. He originally said, believe me to be your most obedient servant, George Frederick Handel. But then he squashes in, and believe me to be, with the greatest respect, your most obedient and most humble servant, George Frederick Handel. At this point, Messiah hadn't yet been a success in England, on the contrary, but Handel recognized the worth of the man who engendered it. Thank you for listening, watching, and here's a reminder, is the cover of the book that you can buy in the Foundling Museum or online. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was so interesting. Goodness, what really lovely slides as well. Also, shipping a piano from Florence, that must have cost an absolute fortune at the time.
Yes, and I think, well, we certainly have some of the paperwork in the exhibition, I think. This was managed by Holdsworth. Holdsworth was immensely important, in fact, in contributing to Jennens's musical life, not only in very patiently dealing with the transit of the piano, but also in actually collecting music manuscripts from Italy for Handel and sending them over. And they were a very important part of his collection, and indeed influenced one of Handel's works, because Jennens, this was at quite an early stage in their acquaintance, Jennens lent Handel some of the Scarlatti manuscripts that Holdsworth had sent to him, and Handel, the great recycler, put some music from them into his oratorio Athaliah, which Jennens went and heard when it was first performed in Oxford, because the young Lord Guernsey, of whom we saw a portrait, young Lord Aylesford, nice gentle looking chap in a red coat, was giving one of the public addresses at the honorary degree ceremony, and Jennens was there, and Handel was giving concerts for the insignia, and Athaliah was being premiered, and Jennens will have noticed that some of the music he had lent to Handel was being recycled in it.
Brilliant. Okay, I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to read you out in the chat.
Oh, yes, thank you. I've now stopped screen sharing, so I can actually see them. Oh, hello, Carol. How nice that you're here. Thank you. Specifically as a polymath, well, yes. I mean, if polymath means knowing things about almost everything, then I think, yes, in terms of 18th century knowledge, he had studied all the major branches of it, and his cultural activities covered almost, I think, every branch of culture except dance, possibly. Poor Jennens, nobody to dance with. So yes, I mean, I don't know whether Carol was thinking of anything in particular that I was missing, or that where Jennens doesn't qualify as a polymath, but he's certainly, I mean, it's our gain that he had these strong political principles and therefore didn't have a profession and therefore had leisure to pursue his interests, and also that he had the money to do it. And it did enable him to follow many, many interests.
Thank you. Right, let's look at Roberts now.
Yes, did Jennens write the libretto for Judas Maccabeus? No. No, he didn't. That was Thomas Morell, who wrote a lot of Handel's late librettos. And yes, you're absolutely right. It's very much celebrating victory over the defeat of the Young Pretender. And clearly, Jennens wouldn't have been somebody to provide a libretto on that subject for Handel. And Handel needed to find another librettist, and Morell got a recommendation from the Prince of Wales to put himself forward to Handel, suggesting that he write a libretto for him. Jennens wasn't too happy when other people wrote librettos for Handel, but all this happened just when Jennens was about to come into his inheritance. And I think after that, his dealings with Handel were, perhaps because they weren't collaborating, were cordial, but not actually creative together. Jennens was obviously hugely engaged with the rebuilding of Gopsall and wasn't about to write pro-Hanoverian librettos, whereas Thomas Morell was perfectly happy to do that. And he went on to provide Handel also with the librettos for his last great oratorios, Theodora and Jephthah.
Thank you, Ruth. We've got Catherine Hogg. Hello, Catherine. Catherine's second question is actually one I had, so I'll be pleased to have this one answered.
Did Holdsworth have the same conflicts about religion and politics? We don't know anything about Holdsworth's religion, but his political principles and his readiness to spend quite a lot of time in Italy suggests that maybe he was more relaxed about them than Jennens, who himself never went to Italy, though there could be other reasons for that than that it was where the Pretender was being sheltered and it was the seat of Roman Catholicism. Myself, I think it may have been mainly Catholicism which made Jennens unwilling to do the grand tour, you know, Italian Catholicism. But certainly Holdsworth's political principles were very strong. In fact, one could say they were stronger than Jennens's, because he does seem to have worked as a Jacobite informer. And in fact, Jennens's and Holdsworth's correspondence must have been opened by the government, the Hanoverian government intelligence services sometimes, because there are moments in the correspondence when they write terribly clearly with false trails about politics, which are, you know, obviously meant to rile the people who have unglued their letters and are reading them.
Goodness. And the second part of Catherine's question, and indeed Geoffrey Davis's, is what happened to the collection?
Oh, yes. Well, this is such a sad story. After the First War, a lot of noble families in England were severely impoverished, and that included the family that then owned Gopsall, descendants of Jennens's niece's son, a Curzon, and then it was the Earl's Howe. And Gopsall was sold, and there was a sale of its contents in 1918, which was abysmally catalogued. You know, it says things like sermons, another 10 volumes, and lots of misattributions and lots of questionable attributions. And in fact, very recently, a painting has come up for sale, which has been suggested to be a portrait of Jennens. And I don't think it is. I think it may be a portrait of Jennens's father. That suggestion has been made by people who know better than I do, and I think it could be quite true. But the collection was dispersed, and it's very difficult to trace any of it. That doesn't apply to the music collection, but it does apply to the paintings and sculptures. But as I say, they crop up now and again, and I've never seen that picture I showed you of St. Jerome showing baby Jesus, his translation of the Bible. I've never seen that published as belonging to Jennens's collection, but you can trace it on the web to a collection in Bloomington, Indiana.
Very good. Useful to know that. Yes, what a shame. It's a huge collection. Derek has a comment rather than a question, but I believe it is interesting. And do you have anything to say on that other than probably agree?
Yes. Well, I mean, of course, I agree that it's potent, but Derek is more of a theologian than I am. And it would be interesting to, if he was prepared to be unmuted, he might like to, to say more about the ways in which he considers it potent. But should we look at some?
Let's finish up the questions first.
Mark's question about wealth. Well, industry, iron. I mean, we are here at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and the Jennens family got in early. They made basic iron, but they also made things from it. The Jennens family had several lines in Birmingham where they were centered. This was the beginning of Birmingham as a great city and the beginning of great industrialism. Occasionally people dig up buttons with the Jennens mark on them from the 18th century. So that, they were industrial magnates, and that was the source of the wealth. I'm not sure the land brought them much, but I'm afraid, I mean, nowadays we would be very shocked that they had the land so that they could get the timber from it to make the charcoal to drive the furnaces. So cutting down trees, I'm afraid.
Well, got to make your money somehow. And it's Lindy. Hello, Lindy. Did Jennens leave any bequests to public bodies on his death? Did he leave money to the church?
Yes, he did. Now, I haven't got the whole list, but one of my early slides, perhaps Lindy wasn't there then, did list his bequests on his tomb. And it includes bequests to the 6 London hospitals, which he had helped to found, and a bequest for lectures on the catechism to be given locally. He returned the tithes, which were due to the landowner, to the church. What else can I remember from that? As I said, a hospital for a home for former prostitutes, a girls' orphanage, local schools. Very generous bequests to a lot of public bodies. I mean, he was a great donor. As I said, the bequests amounted in modern terms to over £1 million. I hope that answers the question. I'm rather worried that I said all that before, so Lindy might be thinking of something else.
No, that sounds good. We can always pick up extra bits later on. And finally, I've got another one. It's from Jeffrey again, who says that seemed to indicate that the music collection was not dispersed. Where did it end up?
Yes, thank you for helping to make that clear. Yes, it didn't stay completely intact, but it is now mainly in Manchester in the Henry Watson Library, and you can go and see it there. And it's very valuable. I showed you that slide of the Brocker's Passion at the end with Jennens's English translation of the text. That's in the library in Manchester. It's a very interesting collection in as much, well, for several reasons, but in one way, it's unique in that sometimes the copies that were made for Jennens were made immediately after Handel had finished the autograph score, the working copy, and before the fair copy was made by his main copyist. And so an intermediate stage, Handel's scores were very, they mutated a lot between his finishing the draft and his actual performance. And music scholars have a great deal of work to do unpicking these mutations. And in that sequence, quite often, the scores in Manchester are an important piece of evidence.
That's wonderful. Oh, I was gonna tap out, but Colin's come in with the last one. So let's have a look at Colin's one. Ooh.
Well, yes, a bit. Their social network. When Holdsworth is telling Jennens who he's going to be traveling with, they are quite often people from young men from non-juring or Jacobite families that Jennens knows as well. And they talk about them a bit to each other. But I think Jennens's main social network was what they called the brother Handelists, other Handel enthusiasts, and other Handel collaborators. I mean, one of his friends was James Harris, who worked with Jennens, and indeed was the principal originator for Handel's L'Allegro, Il Penseroso, and Il Moderato. And for that, we have absolutely fascinating sort of triangular creativity in real time in some of Jennens's correspondence with Harris. Jennens reporting what Handel is saying, Jennens and Handel both being in London, Harris being in Salisbury, and amending the libretto as they go. And quite often we hear the other brother Handelists telling each other what Jennens has learned from Handel about plans for next season. I mean, Jennens was a very close friend of Handel, a supporter, very interested in his welfare, as Handel acknowledged, and I think was a conduit to the other brother Handelists about the master and what he was doing. I think these young sprigs of the nobility, they were still, some of them teenagers, and yes, one could probably trace through their families and see what their non-juring connections were, but they weren't particularly, I think, contacts of Jennens's.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, this has been an absolutely wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Ruth. Absolutely brilliant, fascinating, and in fact, our last talk until September, so what a wonderful one to finish it up on. So thank you ever so much, and some really, really interesting questions as well. Really great to see everyone participating. This talk will be put online at some point when we upload it, so call it like a week or so. But basically, if you check our YouTube channel, type in the Foundling Museum, you'll find us there. You can see previous talks we've done as well, and Ruth will be up very soon. So thank you very much. Obviously, if you'd like to buy the book, you can do it by visiting the Foundling Museum, which you should do, because then you can see the exhibition that goes with the book. And then
lovely. Can I just interrupt to say it is a lovely exhibition. It's really, really nice and very nicely laid out.
Thank you. So come along, and if you can't do that, then drop us an email, either handel@foundlingmuseum.org.uk or inquiries@foundlingmuseum.org.uk, and we can arrange payment and postage. And if you've got any questions for Ruth that you didn't manage to slip in this time, you can send those to and we will forward them on. All right, I'm going to draw it to a close. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. It was wonderful. All right, then. Bye.